There is no question that Jujutsu Kaisen Season 2 scarred and bruised a lot of our favorite characters, especially with the Shibuya incident. But regardless of all the losses, the events of that arc could only go on to shape the next generation of sorcerers. So why don't we cover how the Shibuya incident shaped the lives of all the survivors? Though I make it sound like we'll be covering a whole lot of the characters who survived did not really undergo much of a change. Yaga and Choco, for example, those two weren't particularly frontliners, but still critical to stopping the events. By virtue of them not being at the front lines, their conviction and principles were never put to the test, so for them they weren't scarred. Shibuya to those two was just business as usual. Exercise the curses, detain the curse users, and then heal the injured. A very similar thing applies to the Kyoto bunch, especially the half that arrived late in the game, with Miwa probably being the only exception. When the group consisting of Noritoshi, Miwa, Momo, Mai and their sensei Utahime stepped foot in Shibuya, it's explained to us that two others from Kyoto had already arrived earlier, those two being Nita and Aotodo. Now Todo could technically be considered for this video, since the aim is to cover everyone the Shibuya experience changed, but the thing is we haven't really gotten to see much of Todo ever since the incident, so we can't really pick apart his experiences and delve into what he learned moving forward. Nita just tags along, serving as a plot device. He's the very reason Nobara's state of being is unconfirmed till this date. Besides, he didn't really undergo any direct confrontation, and he's not also been seen ever since. As established previously, Momo, Noritoshi, Mai and their sensei Utahime don't exactly pick up anything new from the Shibuya incident. They were also included in the arc to ease things off, but as we all know, they aren't the only members of the Kyoto squad, so why did I fail to neglect the other? Well, that's because Miwa actually learned something, or at least her experiences from Shibuya remain relevant to the story even till this point in the manga. It's pretty much famous at this point that Miwa's move against Kenjaku was not the brightest. While the others charged in with plain old regular attacks, Miwa set upon herself a binding vow, one that would draw out possibly her full potential, pushing her use of the simple domain to the absolute limit, hoping that this would be enough to stop or at least wear down Sudogeto. But unlike the way she expected things to go, the fan base expected things to unfold in a completely different way, and in the end, the expectations of the community proved to be the reality. Reading this in the manga, a lot of fans, myself included, didn't pay much heed to the exact words used in the binding vow. Miwa specifically says she'll never pick up a katana again, and just a while back in the manga, Neg-Gate chose to remind us of that, referencing that very moment, and she herself sees it as a flaw. After all, she's useless Miwa, why throw away the only thing she had going for her? But who knows, katanas aren't the only tools we've seen in JJK. Inumaki and Panda also don't get a lot of experiences from Shibuya. Granted, Inumaki did lose his arm, but there wasn't room for him to learn anything. Inumaki, throughout his duration on screen in the event, was relegated to handling transfigured humans. It's an important task in itself, after all they have to protect civilians from the attacks, but because of the strength level of the transfigured humans, fighting them didn't enable him push himself and his techniques to their limits. And Panda wasn't that much different. Panda was paired up with Kusakabe, so unfortunately we didn't get to see as much of him as we saw in season 1, and when we did see him, we barely got to see him in action. If Kusakabe had his way hiding, then we probably wouldn't have gotten to see Panda transform. At the final moments of the arc, Panda is seen charging in with the rest of Jujutsu Society, but just like the others, he's halted in his tracks, effectively being able to do really nothing of significance, and because of that he doesn't really seem to gain experience points, and in the calling games he doesn't seem to have developed in any way as a sorcerer. And then there is Megumi Fushiguro. Surprisingly, Megumi being one of the main protagonists, it's strange that he didn't get that much learning done in the arc. Megumi did a whole lot in the arc, but he mostly relied on his intellect, and that did him a whole lot of good. But let's not act like we didn't all know that Megumi was pretty sharp, even for a sorcerer. His experiences in Shibuya don't seem to be much of a factor he considers with actions he takes in the future. Fushiguro could have learned a whole lot this past arc. For example, he fought his dad, but he didn't even get to know that the man he faced was his father. Unlike we, the fan base, he didn't get to find out about the whole ordeal with Naobito and Toji, these being matters that are central to his character. After all, said ordeal concerned the possession of himself. But even beyond that, Megumi is quickly retired in the arc. After finally submitting to use Maharaga, the Shikigami quickly puts Megumi to rest, and so he never even got to see this Maharaga in action, so he doesn't even get to have an idea of the strength of his go-to Shikigami whenever things get tough. If Megumi was still around after the disaster curses got took down, after everything with Sukuna and Toji, when Kenjaku relayed his plans to the group, then things might have gotten a bit more interesting. Megumi could have obviously picked up a thing or two from the way Geto uses his curses. After all, in theory, it's very similar to Megumi's 10 shadows, and being as sharp as he was, he might have actually formulated a strategy, one that would enable them actually unseal Satoru, especially with the presence of Yuki Tsukumo near the end. Stepping away from Megumi for a bit, there was Yuji. Yuji's impressive efforts throughout the calling games and everything he's doing now against Sukuna would not be possible if he hadn't undergone the Shibuya incident. It's not an overstatement to say that Yuji Itadori suffered a whole lot in Shibuya. Mentally, physically, and emotionally, this 15-16-year-old boy was abused, from the killing of his sensei Gojo to having to experience the death of his other mentor figure, possibly losing a friend in Nobara, getting a friend in harm's way, resulting in that friend losing their curse technique, and then what he views as the ultimate sin, his possession of Sukuna. One of the more emotional moments in JJK as a whole could only have been brought about with Sukuna and Itadori's dynamic. After Itadori is fed those extra fingers, Sukuna goes on a rampage, resulting to the loss of a couple hundred civilians. Yuji attains back control of his body, but when he comes to, the person of Yuji Itadori was not ready to see what had become of the city. And then the moment hits, Yuji is at the lowest we've ever seen him be. But you know what? This is Yuji Itadori. He gets back up. Speaking of learning things, Yuji already learnt from back in season 1 that he's just a cog in a machine. He reminds himself of this and gets back up, hoping to continue on the mission, but unfortunately, Gege had other plans. Subsequently, Yuji is greeted with the sight of the demise of Nanami and Nobara, these two being put down literally within his line of sight, but he was too weak to act. This character arc he started right as he entered the barriers to Shibuya was then beautifully completed with the defeat of Mahito. After the arc, we see that Yuji is completely different. A lot of fans say Yuji lost his smile after Shibuya, and there is no denying that there is truth in that, but one cannot truly lose one's smile when they are still surrounded by some loved ones. A whole lot goes down in the calling games. Yuji is confronted with the weight he put upon himself in Shibuya. Higuruma explains to him that he's not to blame for the death of all those civilians. When tasked with recruiting Hakari, he puts up an unwavering front. He's beaten and battered down by Hakari, but he chooses to stand his ground, hoping to prove something to Kinji. When offered assistance from his allies, he rejected it because he wanted to prove himself to Hakari, and his approach seemed to be successful. You see, unlike with Megumi and Panda, Yuji previously just had a conversation with Hakari. He knows what Hakari expects from him, and he delivers. After all, failure would mean they wouldn't have Hakari on their side, and who knows how the calling games would have turned out in that case. But I don't want to talk too much about the calling games, as that can be a video in it of itself. In Shibuya, Yuji is also introduced to the fact that Kenjaku is his parent in one way, shape or form. He denies the fact, but we all know that it would come to be true. After knowing of his parents, he was granted a big brother in Choso. Though speaking of Choso, he learnt a thing or two from this arc as well. He changed quite a bit after he found out that he had another brother. After all, to Choso, family meant everything. Choso was determined to avoid making the same mistakes he made with Eso and Kechizu. Anyways, besides those two, Gojo also learns a whole lot about himself in Shibuya. Maybe not as much as in Hidden Inventory, but a lot regardless. And his findings became apparent in his fight with Sukuna. The biggest flaw with Gojo's actions in Shibuya when he was faced with the disaster curses and Kenjaku laid in his conviction and resolve. Gojo Satoru wasn't someone who could bring himself to kill his best friend, at least not a second time. This expected delay, the human response, was was exactly what the enemy took advantage of. He got sealed into the prison realm. Most of the sorcerers we've covered so far learned something that could improve their skill set as sorcerers or characters in general. But with Wee, it's not exactly the same. He would only have learned a new thing if it was the first time he and his sister got together. So I guess we learned a lot from that in the arc. Even though those are the real major ones I thought to cover, it was here in Shibuya that the man previously thought to be Suguru Geto all this time had been Kenjaku all along. We and the characters are given a bit of lore about the Heian era, especially those who stuck around for his little speech at the end. If you enjoyed this video, then please feel free to leave a like, and if you have something to say, then you can put it in the comments. And then to stay updated with the channel, feel free to subscribe.